Well, today I'm really excited because we have one of our Whistle partners here, and this is Dr. Richard Chambers. He is an expert in sustainable peak performance and conscious leadership. And we're just going to have a conversation around different topics and really just kind of get into it with how someone should adapt to a new role. Why don't we talk about that, Dr. Chambers? Can you share your experience in adapting to new roles, not only throughout your career, but with the people that you've helped, and in particular in those high performance environments?
Yeah, great. Well, nice to be here with you, Bre, first of all. Yeah, and I've had a lot of roles in my time, both in large organizations and startups, and also doing my own thing. I'm an entrepreneur. And so often I've had to juggle multiple hats. I've had to transition into whole new things. And it, of course, as your listeners would know, it brings with it a lot of challenges. And at times I've been totally grounded and focused and present and in the zone. And then, of course, other times things have pulled me out of that. And I found myself perhaps, working too hard, working long hours, perhaps at risk of burnout. And so it's really interesting, through my own experience, learning what kinds of things help me to navigate challenges and opportunities in a skillful way, and also noticing what pulls me out of that. And anything that I use with my clients, anything I teach in my workshops or use with my coaching clients, I've always road tested them myself. And so I draw on my own experience and my own wisdom, and then I find out what helps other people. And I've seen, there are some basic principles that really help people to navigate transitions into new roles. And there are some common challenges that people face and things that pull us out of our center and lead to things like stress and burnout.
Can you expand upon that a little bit? I mean, what are those common circumstances that lead people maybe to a new role? And as they're adapting to those new roles, what are some suggestions you have for people to, I guess, ease into it a little bit?
Yeah, well, look, one of the challenges with new roles is that there's so much to learn. There's a whole new set of skills often that we need to get our head around. There's a whole new team that we have to learn how to operate within. And, then there's the culture of the organization that we're operating in. And so all of these things create a lot of unknowns and uncertainty. And I'm a psychologist by background, right? And so the human brain, I can tell you, and I'm sure your listeners will be able to resonate with this, and I'm sure you do too. When we're faced with unknowns, we often fill that vacuum or that void with worries and concerns, and we can often get a little bit self-critical or self-judgmental. And so that the negativity bias in the human brain really comes in. And so being aware of that is one of the first steps. So if we find ourselves perhaps worrying that we're not doing a good enough job, or worrying that, that we've been hired for a role that perhaps, maybe we feel like a bit of an imposter, often we start to sort of doubt ourselves. We start to focus on our mistakes, on the things that we don't know. And that can, of course, make us feel stressed and feel like an imposter. And then one of the typical patterns people get into is trying to prove themselves. So they work long hours, they work really hard, and that first 3 months often is a time that people are out of their center and perhaps feeling a little bit stressed, noticing their sleep impacted or their ability to connect with their loved ones. These are really common things that I've seen happen.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I know that at times when I have transitioned into new roles, I've experienced all of those things, as is probably typical, like we said, of everybody. In particular, in this modern world that we live in, navigating time zones can be really difficult, right? I mean, as it is right now, it's 7:30 at night my time, and what time is it your time?
10:40 a.m. where I am. So yeah.
You're in the future. And so
we are. I'm in Australia, so we're always in the future. The only people more futuristic than us are the New Zealanders.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And it's interesting because oftentimes I think in my personal experience, and I'm sure you've noticed this with people you've worked with, that you're trying to overcome those challenges while navigating those time zones. So how do you suggest that people get through those types of experiences?
Well, there are a few different things that we need to do, but one of the most basic is healthy work-life integration. And this is something that's not easy to do when we're in a new role, just overwhelmed with the amount of information, and at the same time trying to prove ourselves and show that we were a good hire or that we are the right person for this role. And when we're navigating different time zones, that makes it even harder, because sometimes the people that we're having meetings with and the teams that we're working with might be in a radically different time zone. And so it's very easy to book those meetings at 8 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock in the morning. And sometimes that's necessary. But if that becomes a sort of a culture, if that becomes something that we do by default, over time, that's going to deplete us. And when we're depleted, then our brains aren't working as well. And when our brains aren't working as well, obviously our cognition isn't going as well as it could. So then we're not able to think clearly and remember things as well as we might normally be able to do. And that then makes us feel further behind. And so then we work often harder and longer, and we can get into a negative spiral there. So one of the first things that's really important to do is just to take care of our basic well-being. We need 7 to 9 hours of good quality sleep every night, and that good quality sleep includes getting enough deep sleep and REM sleep. And so the way that we structure our day and the way that we structure our activity during the day is one of the biggest predictors of whether we sleep well or whether we don't.
Yeah. Well, would you suggest then that when somebody is obviously pursuing a role or interviewing for a role, that, they probably dig deep into those questions to assess if, hey, does this really fit my lifestyle if I am going to advance my career? But I think that's probably another element of pressure that people feel like, if I want to go farther, I want to make more money, or I want a new title, these are things that I have to do. And maybe they put that kind of as it's not that big of a deal until it becomes a big deal.
Yeah, and it is a big deal. It just is from the beginning. So I think it's a good point when we're thinking about what our next role might be, when we're applying for that role, when we're navigating the interview process and negotiating what that role is going to look like. Keeping these things top of mind can be really important. Maybe that means that we choose roles in our own time zone because we know that that's going to suit us better. Maybe it means that we do find a role or choose a role that is in, that operates in different time zones, but then we need to be really conscious about how we navigate ourselves through that. And just putting our well-being aside while we find our feet in a new role, that generally doesn't work that well. I mean, it's okay in the short term, maybe the first few months, maybe 6 months, maybe even 12 months, we can do that. But in my experience, when I'm coaching people and they do that over time, when they put their own needs aside and deprioritize their well-being in order to meet the expectations of the role, whether that's the external expectations, like what actually needs to be done, or their own expectations about how well they're going to do in those first 3, 6, 12 months, when they put their needs aside and don't take care of themselves, that eventually has a cost. And as I said, the cost is to their well-being. People start to burn out, their brains aren't working as well, and so we can very easily get into a negative loop. And so the solution to that is just to be very clear at the beginning about what we're capable of, what we're willing to offer, and to find a way of negotiating that. And that might even include in interviews, to talk about, well, how do you tend to manage having employees in different time zones? How do you help them to make sure that they maintain well-being? And of course, when we think about well-being and performance as two sides of the same coin, that then empowers us to have those kinds of conversations, because it's difficult, isn't it, in an interview process? We want to be as accommodating as possible, and that, of course, there'd be the temptation to just say, look, I'll fit in, I'll make it work. But sometimes, if there's an opportunity to say, hey, how do you manage your remote teams, people in different time zones? How do you make sure that they operate at their best over the long term and make things sustainable and avoid things like burnout and unnecessary stress, and finding a way of making that work? And sometimes we do need to jump on that 6 a.m. meeting, or we do need to work late into the evening. But as I said before, if that just becomes the default setting and we just do it as part of our role without any consciousness around it and without any negotiation, it doesn't tend to work that well long term.
Well, how would you suggest when somebody is in the role that they're starting to experience this and things are suffering, like, maybe they're active in their health and fitness, or that their sleep just isn't happening. How would you suggest that they address that appropriately with their leadership team, so that it's recognized as saying, hey, I want to show up and be the best version of
Yes.
myself and the best employee here because I want to be here, but I have to find balance. So how would you suggest somebody start to have that conversation?
I think making the point that well-being and performance are in the end the same thing. That's something that tends to go really well when I'm coaching my clients, and I help them to understand, first of all, for themselves, how that's true. That's it's got to begin with us. We've got to realize that if we're going to perform at our best, we need to have a healthy brain that's had its 8 hours of sleep, and it's got, we're spending time in nature and spending time with loved ones, and we're still doing the things that we love. We're exercising, we're engaging in our hobbies and interests. When we do all of those things well enough, then we tend to thrive. And when we're thriving and we're feeling good and our brains are working well, then we're just able to show up in a way that's much better than if we're feeling depleted and worn out. And so I think recognizing that in ourselves is the first step, so that we realize, what, I'm going to maintain some healthy routines. I'm going to put some boundaries in place. These are things that are important for me. But then I think you answered your own question. Communicating that to our own leaders is really important, because sometimes they don't recognize that. Sometimes our leaders are out of balance and their work-life integration isn't too great, and they might be stressed or tired or sort of depleted in some ways, and so they might not. And so, of course, as we know, certain cultures like startup culture are notorious at not understanding this. The idea is just, working long hours is the way that we get this business over the line. But to help the people around us to understand that if I'm feeling good and I'm happy and I'm relaxed, I'm going to be more engaged, my brain's going to work better, I'm going to be more efficient, I'm going to be better at what I do. And so that's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, I like how you brought that up. I read a book a few years ago by Ariana Huffington talking about, and you're probably familiar with it, talking about obviously sleep deprivation and what she experienced when building
Yes.
the Huffington Post, and literally passed out in her office from exhaustion, from not getting enough sleep, fractured, her one of the bones in her face. And it was a huge wake-up call that, especially even as a leader of a company, that she was pushing herself well past, the needs, or well past where a human should be, and was able to address that, with some leadership. I found that myself in a position in a previous role where I had a very demanding CEO, and, he was up at 3 a.m. sending messages and emails and Slacks. And there was this unspoken expectation
Yes.
that you would respond as soon as possible. Even if
Yep.
your work hours didn't start until 8 a.m., if you saw it at 6 a.m., you would respond. And I found that for myself to be a very toxic environment, which led to, coming into like our next topic, that imposter syndrome. It intensified that because,
Yeah.
wanting to show up and then having those unspoken expectations were very difficult to navigate. So, when it comes to, imposter syndrome, how do you help the clients that you work with work through that and navigate those waters?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And, just going back to what you said, I think there are three things here. There are the external pressures that we're under, and leadership is a big source of that. What our leaders are modeling for us tends to influence our behavior. So that's the first one. Then there's the internal pressure that we put on ourselves, and sometimes that leads to us not maintaining healthy boundaries. And then the deeper internal cause, as you said, is the imposter syndrome. And it's really interesting that you referenced Ariana Huffington and then your own experience of working in the organization that you're talking about. And these are extreme examples. If you take someone like Ariana Huffington passing out and fracturing her face bones, that's an extreme example. If you look at Elon Musk and how he pushes his employees, that there are these obvious extreme examples, but it's important to bring it right back and say that, this is happening in a lot of companies, often in less obvious ways, less obvious. So let me talk about quickly a client of mine, Michelle, who's happy for me to name her. She's my star coaching client at the moment. She's giving me glowing testimonials, and she lets me talk about her journey because it can really help others. So she's in a senior role now, a strategic role in a retail company here in Australia, one of our major retailers. And when I first started working with her, she had this belief that a good leader is available 24/7, must be contactable at all times for her team in order for them to feel supported. And that's what a good leader is. And so she had this unchallenged belief around what a good leader is. And at the same time had a growing awareness that somehow the way she was showing up was putting her at risk of burnout. And so the first thing that we did with her was to look at just her basic routines and her work-life integration, and to start establishing healthier boundaries. So she started to put them in place, and clocking off at 7 o'clock at night, and not responding to emails that weren't emergencies until 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. or something like that. And so she started to put some healthy boundaries in place, but pretty quickly started to bump into that imposter syndrome that you mentioned. And deep down, she was starting to think, well, hang on a sec, maybe I'm not as smart as everybody else. Maybe I'm not as capable or talented as the other people in the team that I'm in. And, she was often in a room of very smart people. And she started to doubt herself. And that was a blocker to really establishing these healthy routines, because she thought, well, if I'm not as smart as everybody else, when she believed that story, I'm not as smart as everybody else. If that's true to you, it's just a belief that she held, but when that was true to her, of course it was going to lead her to put pressure on herself and go the extra mile, even if that was going to come back and bite her later on. And so what we did was to challenge those unconscious beliefs around being not capable enough, not as smart as everybody else, not good enough. And as she started to see that they were just beliefs that she was holding that weren't necessarily true, she was more able to establish clear boundaries. And what that meant was she started taking better care of herself, and her well-being improved, her work engagement improved, her ability to perform improved. But it had some really important ripple effects as well. Her team started noticing that she was clocking off at night and she wasn't responsive 24/7. And that gave them permission to also have healthy work-life boundaries, because obviously, if our leaders are emailing us at 3 a.m., like you mentioned, that does implicitly sort of suggest that we need to be doing the same thing. But when our leaders start to embody healthy integration, it gives the message to our team that they can do the same thing, and that's okay. And so her team actually started to thrive. They started performing better and feeling better. So there's that win-win again. And it also improved her personal brand, because her manager could tell that she was out of balance, but didn't really know what was going on. But when she said to him, hey, I have been sort of, working these long hours and I haven't maintained effective work-life boundaries. And I'm going to start doing that because I can see that that's good for my well-being and my performance and the well-being and performance of my team. Suddenly he knew where she stood, and he actually respected her more as a result of her having that conversation. And that led to her getting a major promotion. So it was actually very good for her and everybody around her. But the key was that, as you mentioned, that deep down, the work that I often do with people is around imposter syndrome, because most people have that on some level. I think it's particularly prevalent for women, but even a lot of the men that I work with, a lot of just, if we come to the self-compassion research for a second, so you've had this mindfulness research for the last 40 years, and part of mindfulness is the relationship we have with ourselves. And so self-compassion and being kind to ourselves when things are difficult is inherently part of the mindfulness journey. But about 15 years ago, Kristen Neff, can't remember which university she's based at, but she's the main figure in self-compassion. She sort of split off from the mindfulness movement into this and started the self-compassion movement. And she and other people like Tara Brach or Brené Brown, they all talk about how deep down every human being somehow feels like they're either inadequate or defective. We all have some story deep down that we're not we're not enough, we're not good enough, not smart enough, not pretty enough, not kind enough, not, fill in the gap enough, or that there's something wrong with us, that there's some fundamental flaw or fault, or there's something missing that we should have. And most of us just ignore that and hide from it. We don't want to acknowledge that that's there. And what we do instead is work harder and faster to prove that we're enough, or prove there's nothing wrong with us. But deep down, there's a part of us that is worried that we're going to get discovered. And that's the source of imposter syndrome. I do a lot of parts work with my clients. We have different sub-personalities or parts to us. We all know what it's like to want to exercise, and we have this great intention to join a gym and get fit, but there's also part of us that wants to sit on the couch and watch Netflix. Or we set New Year's resolutions, and we have this great idea, and that's one part of us setting the resolution. But then when we're not doing that, it's because some other part of us has a different agenda and a different set of values and beliefs and things that it wants and needs. And so recognizing that is a really important thing. And recognizing that we all have deep down a part of us that feels insecure or inadequate is the first step. And Bre, it's really interesting because we don't want to show that. It's not safe. It doesn't feel safe usually to show that unless we're in a really psychologically safe family or workplace. It doesn't feel safe to be vulnerable. And the problem is everybody's playing this game of pretending that they're invulnerable and pretending that there's nothing going on under the surface. And so when we do feel insecure or inadequate or defective, or we make a mistake and we see that we've dropped the ball on something, we look around and often it seems like everybody else has it together. And it's just us that has the problem because everybody's hiding this. But the beautiful thing is once we realize that all human beings have this on some level, first of all, we experience ourselves just as part of the human race, what researchers call common humanity. It's like, this is just part of being human. We're all just human beings. And we're fallible humans, and we make mistakes, and we doubt ourselves, and that's just part of being human. And that's again a really important step. And then we can start to look at, okay, so what does that part of me need, right? The part of us that feels, let's say, inadequate, it sends another part that's overcompensating and working long, hard hours and putting pressure on ourselves and creating all that stress and burnout. But what does this more sort of vulnerable, let's call it insecure part of us, what does it really need? And usually it's just to feel acknowledged or validated or safe. And we can learn to do that for ourselves. And this is the key that unlocks imposter syndrome, in my experience. A lot of people say just fake it till you make it. And that's the approach that a lot of people take. They just fake it and wait until everything works out. And sometimes that works sort of on the surface, but deep down there's always that part that needs to be related to in a different way. And when people learn self-compassion and learn to relate to their let's call it insecure parts in a way where they accept that that's just part of being human, and they realize that everybody has it, and they learn to speak to that part of themselves in a different way, maybe offering it some reassurance that they're safe or that everything's okay, or that they're enough as they are, that unlocks on the deepest possible level imposter syndrome. And then we don't have to, because if we trust that we're enough, we don't have to prove that we're enough. We can still work hard, and we can still set big goals for ourselves, but we don't have to. But if we can't be with that insecure part, then we've got to keep pedaling faster and faster and faster and hope that we never make mistakes, or no one ever notices that actually we are in the wrong role, or we're not smart enough, or we've been hired where we shouldn't have been, and all that stuff that creates that sense of imposter syndrome.
Well, thank you for that. I feel like I am getting my own personal coaching system. So I'm really, or session. So I'm really glad to be talking to you about this, because I know that one thing that I personally get frequently from people is, you're so confident and you're so strong. And one of the things, as I've been working on that self-compassion, realizing I am enough, that I realize is oftentimes how I present on the outside is not how I feel on the inside. And what people see, where it'll sneak in for me is I'm like, wow, if you only really knew how I felt inside, you wouldn't think that. I have a couple personalized gifts people have given me with the word strength engraved on it. And I found that so interesting because, when you are hyper independent, or you come from a dynamic where you've had to take care of yourself because nobody else was going to do it for you, you kind of charge through in life, which in my own experience, again, leads to those underlying feelings of imposter syndrome. And gosh, is the bottom going to fall out from this? And if it does fall out, how will I look? And that's something I've had to work really hard to get over, to realize that I have to stay present in the moment, because those feelings really come up if I project too far into the future, or I stay in the past and I see maybe where I didn't perform in a way that I had. And so I think what you're doing with your clients of challenging those belief systems is so critical for not only growth in being a peak performer in their profession, but life and in general.
Yes.
It's all about that. Can we talk a little bit, though, move a little bit more into burnout and managing routines? As you're well aware here in the US and with many, I mean, it's global too. And I don't experience this with Whistle, but I worked for an organization where there's this concept of, we have unlimited PTO. And it sounds great, right? You're interviewing, you're like, this is great. And the studies show, at least in the States, people don't take nearly the time off that they had when they had a rigid number of days to take off. And it's interesting because, especially with LinkedIn and everything else, you see people on vacation, on holiday, where they should be relaxing and enjoying themselves, and yet they're still working. So, in our last couple minutes here, because I think we're probably going to have a part two, because you have so much to share, and I'm so grateful for your time. But with particular, like, how do you coach your clients to truly disconnect when they have actually scheduled time off?
Yeah, it's just giving ourselves permission. That's the key, and recognizing the importance of it. Because it's interesting what you mentioned there, that, if we have, in Australia, we have 4 weeks of annual leave every year. I think most American companies have 2, right? Except for the ones that have unlimited leave. And it's a funny paradox. It's a really interesting paradox that when we have a fixed amount of time, it's relatively easy to take that. Not everybody does, but it's somehow paradoxically easier to take that than if we have an unlimited amount, because then we're like, well, how much can I take? How much do I deserve? How much do I need? And it brings it right back to us making our own decisions. And so again, if we're trying to prove something and compensate for some perceived sense of inadequacy or defectiveness, it's very hard to take that leave. But to bring this right down to a practical level, I mean, I've mentioned work-life integration. So healthy boundaries are really important. It used to be that we would have a 9 to 5 in a physical workspace, and then we'd have the third space, which is the traveling between work and home, and home and work, right? Where we might be sitting in the car, and, where we might be commuting. And that was a space where we weren't really doing either. And so we had those 3 spaces: home, the work, and the third space. And that just kept everything more or less in balance for most people. But now, of course, with blended working environments, with, remote teams that are working in different time zones, it's really hard to do that. And so what we need to do is make sure that we have really good routines and boundaries. So what I find works really well is to have a fixed starting and finishing time. Unless we're in a role where we're in a safety role, or we have to be responsive to emergencies happening at all times of day and night, and they bring their own challenges, those roles. If we're not in that kind of role, when is healthy for us to start and finish? That's the first thing, right? I think that I like to meditate every morning, and I encourage anybody I ever work with to do some meditation at some point during the day. In the morning's good if you don't have little kids or something else that's getting in the way, because then you start the day with presence and you start the day mindfully. And then you're going to be more present, more focused, more strategic, and less reactive throughout the day. So I'm a strong advocate of meditation. And Tim Ferriss found that 80% of elite performers around the world, when he was interviewing them for his podcast, 80% of the elite performers all have a daily meditation routine. So that's a powerful thing to do, whether it's in the morning or some other time, making sure that we meditate, not grabbing our phones first thing, because if we grab our phones and check emails or scroll social media, we get a big hit of dopamine first thing in the morning, which then means the rest of the day we feel like we're withdrawing from dopamine. So we're more likely to grab our devices and do things that give us quick dopamine hits. So a healthy morning routine is really important. I personally now get up, and the first thing I do is I go for a 10-minute run. That spikes my cortisol, increases my body temperature, and gets early morning sunlight into my eyes. And these three things will reset my circadian rhythm, meaning that 16 hours later, my body starts preparing for sleep. So I find that incredibly useful. As I said, meditation's important, physical exercise, things that get us in our body and activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So vigorous exercise, of course, activates the sympathetic. But if we let our minds calm down, then things find a balance. And so many people are in the gym watching TV, or they're out jogging, listening to a podcast, and the mind is active. Mindful exercise means we go and exercise and we're just in the body, feeling our sensations, feeling our breath, and that will activate our parasympathetic nervous system, as does time in nature, time with loved ones, genuine connection with people, pets, doing the things that we love, our hobbies, and the things that we tend to enjoy tend to be things that engage us in our senses, get us out of our heads, and help us to activate our parasympathetic nervous system. So these are really important ingredients. So if I summarize, healthy work-life balance, a balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activation, really important, and doing that very consciously. And then the third piece is making sure that our peak performance is sustainable. So we want to make sure that we're not doing it trying to prove something, that we're doing that inner work to trust that we're enough. And then we're working in ways that are still perhaps operating at a very high level and getting a lot done, but we're able to flexibly step out of that. Like my client, Michelle, started to step out of it, and rather than starting to get anxious and, oh my God, maybe I'm doing the wrong thing, and maybe I'm going to get in trouble or something's not going to work out, just to know on a deep level that that's okay to do that. And in fact, is going to make what she does much more sustainable over the long term. And so giving ourselves permission to do this is important too. Setting up those routines, giving ourselves permission, and then doing the inner work so that we can actually prioritize our own well-being, as well as the well-being of the people around us, as well as performance and hitting those KPIs. So these are the kinds of things that I found work really well personally, and when I teach them to my clients.
Wow. I've gotten so much out of this conversation. I know that those who watch it are going to get so much. And I even have so many more questions to ask.
Well, let's do it again. Let's. I'd love to come back on anytime you're ready. We can go deeper into any of the things that I've just said.
Absolutely, because it's clear to see why you are an expert at what you do. And I think what resonates even more is that you truly have a deep caring for people being their personal best. So you are definitely in the right role. So I want to thank you for your time, for showing up with us tonight, and for being such a good partner with Whistle. And I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're absolutely welcome. It's a joy to talk about these kinds of things because they're so important, and I do have a lot of personal experience and wisdom to share. So I'd like to thank you as well for having me on and asking such great questions. I'd also like to thank your listeners and viewers. And if any of this is resonating with them, please let us know. If there are any follow-up questions that they have, maybe they could help guide our next conversation, Bre.
Absolutely. And on that note, can you maybe tell them where's the best way to follow your work or to connect with you?
So I'm Dr. Richard Chambers, and my website is drrichardchambers.com, drrichardchambers.com. And that's the best place to see what I do, see the kinds of results that I've produced for coaching clients and organizations, and to get in touch.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you for our time. Until next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.